Well, so first, thank you to Patrick Gray for organizing this conference, and thank you to the four speakers, who addressed, my work. Thank you to all of them. But of course, I will not comment, on the detail of their own comments. I hate this situation when I am the examiner, saying this is right, this is, you have it right, you have it true, you have it wrong, etc., etc. Of course, don't like it. So I think it's more rather than responding, to each of the speakers, perhaps it. I try to do something else, which will be a bit messy. I must announce, because I wrote it very quickly, but I think it was perhaps, but rather than answering, it will be perhaps more interesting, to retrace some of the ways, through which, I came to write the text, that they commented, and to propose the analysis, or make the statements that have provoked their interest and sometimes their perplexity or objections. Well, it happens that I have written a lot of books, on various big topics, politics, aesthetics, literature, film, etc. But it must be clear that none of these books, was written with the intention of developing a theory of politics, art, literature, film, etc., etc., of developing a theory of equality, freedom, and so on. So I never had the idea, I will write a book to develop my my theory of literature and choose good examples, to illustrate it. And as I said this morning, well. I've never been really interested, in starting from theories, discussing theories, but well, I've always worked, through, I would say, the analysis of singularities, case studies if you want, but not case studies as example, to illustrate a notion, but case studies, well, precisely, insofar as case studies, raise a problem. What is happening here? So when I'm analyzing a text, even if it is a philosophical text, as in the case of of this short passage of aesthetics, about Berrios beggars, my problem is not Hegel's theory of art, my problem is, how it happens that at this moment, in a book or in a of a philosopher, even if it is not exactly a book, it's course, etc. But at this moment, there is this kind of strange focus, on this painting. So, which also means, that well, I'm not at all, illustrating a theory of freedom, by looking at. Those paintings by Murillo, but really trying to think what is happening, in this text, what is happening when in a philosophy text, you can really, we can really see the way in which all way of looking at paintings, a whole way, of really classifying, pictures, is totally upset, and also it's also. So about, because the question was raised, of the relation between eventality and historicity, I would say that it is through the event, that happening, for instance, in a text, in a critic, that I try, also to draw, the historical context. For instance, Murillo's painting, or Hegel's analysis of Murillo's painting interests me also because behind it there is all the story, of the opening of the museum, the museum with paintings. So not being no more, really assigned a specific destination, but being just seen, as painting. And of course, also behind there is a revolution. There is the fact, that the French armies, by ransacking, everywhere in Europe, had created some kind of as a universal visibility of painting. So my point is really how well, about history, is how for a specific event, we can think of what is happening, in the wider field of history. So I would say, but at any time, my point is, well, what is happening, And for instance, we were discussing, about mute speech, and I will go back over the discussion, But for instance, really my starting point about, about the separation of the belles lettres and literature, it did not start at all, from Blanchot and from, and from the Athenaeum, It started, from critics, I read, the critics, books critics, in the Revue des Deux Mondes. So the Revue des Deux Mondes, was a big journal, in France in the 1830s, And it is in reading, an article by, by a writer, I've totally forgotten now, Gustave Planche, it was a critique of Notre Dame de Paris, And really, and really, I don't know if it is an epiphany, etc. But I got the idea. But what was at stake, Because Gustave Planche, commenting on Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, saying, well, there is something apparently fantastic that now the stones speak, But this means that now, human people have become stones, And so, and it is from the text, the text, of this kind, But I had the idea of something happening, not happening in theories, not happening in manifestos, but happening in ways of writing, So there is a moment when, there is somebody, a critic who says, there is something happening in this book, and he tries to describe, to narrate what is happening, And it is from this kind of description, from this kind of cases, that most of the time, I could really raise, bigger issues, And for instance, in this case, think of the relation between what literature means and what the belles lettres were, Well, this may. This ties up with an other characteristic of my research and my writing, which is that my way of constructing and reconstructing, the objects of research, most of the time, they came from encounters, from encounters and from surprising encounters, that made me deviate, not only deviate from my ideas on this or that topic, but really from the very frame of the research, so that I try, at this moment to construct, new links and new frames, theoretical scaffoldings, and which sometimes may prove just provisional or transitional, And I think what's interesting, two of the presentation, were dedicated to mute speech, And in a way, mute speech is, for me, specifically a kind of transitional text, not at all a theory of literature, but a transitional text, because, well, of course, at the very at the very beginning, well, my problem was not literature in itself, well, the problematic of mute speech, I had constructed it, not at all in reference with literature, with linguistic, etc. Not I had constructed it. So in relation to Plato's, of course, famous critic of writing, which I read. I must say, Derrida wrote, of course, read it, and many people commented on it, but in a totally different way, So with absolutely no relation, no confrontation, But well, so at the starting point, of mute speech, there was this link, that Plato, makes between writing, as a certain practice, of speech, with let us say, democracy in the widest sense, of the word, with the famous idea that the mutilator, circulates and speaks to everybody, not knowing to whom you must speak and to whom you must not speak. And well, in the philosopher of and this poor, I linked, this theory of new speech, of course, with Plato's, republic, and with the idea that the artisans, must stay at their place and just do their own business. But of course, if I could do it, if I could create this kind of problematic, of the mute speech, well, it was because before I had been immersed, in this research, 10 years research, about workers' texts, workers' archives, etc., etc. And the fact is, that, well, during the course of my research, I've been really pushed out of my way, by something was totally surprising, like something that I did not expect at all, Well, I had started this research, at the beginning of the 70s with the idea, because apparently, there is something wrong, in the Marxist view of workers' history, I must try, to reconstruct some kind of a real history. So my project at the beginning was really to reconstruct, the whole history of the working class in France, and so I wanted at the beginning, at the same time to do it, with the idea to trace the emergence of an autonomous workers' thought that would have been based, on struggles, strikes, workers' associations, corporations, popular forms of life, social relations, etc., etc., Then I stumbled, upon this excess of words. So I stumbled upon those letters those letters, between workers, speaking of Victor Hugo, of Dante, etc., describing metaphysical discussions, and so on. And also I stumbled upon this, also those many texts, relating always in the same way, and this morning, so David Bell, you made a reference, to Claude Genoux, to the discovery of the book. But of course, the discovery of the book, it's a kind of myth. It's a kind of myth, the way in which, workers account for their discovery of the intellectual world, but always through the idea of the book, as a fragmentary book, a lonely book discovered, in a specific place, a book generally without a cover, with pages, missing, etc., etc. So, or even sometimes, description of the encounter with the letter, through a scrap, the scrap of paper, picked up in the street, and also I stumbled on this huge discussion and polemics about workers' literature, also in 19th century, where some people, saying that they should not write, something saying that they should rather write, popular songs, things like that, following the rhythm of work and popular festivals, etc., etc. So really, I stumbled on all this material, that perhaps for me, created really the idea that, what was perhaps crucial was the way in which circulation, of the so-called mutilator, could create really this kind of deviation, in the normal course of popular lives and popular destinies. And this is what I tried. This is what I tried to follow, and it was kind of a reorientation of all my research. But because something had happened, something that I did not expect, And this is how I constructed this problematic of literarity, which precisely has nothing to do with what literarity or literariness, could mean, in a series of literature. because what people were looking at the moment, were looking for at that moment, it was precisely finding a specific linguistic, property, so accounting for the difference between literature and ordinary language. While for me, the literarity meant the specific relation, of the circulation of the letter and the way in which that circulation, takes hold of popular bodies, and make them deviate from their destiny. And this is in the wake of this reconstruction, that I first wrote the words of history. The words of history, were telling how history, trying to say history happens because of those words, those words that precisely speak to those to whom they should not speak. And at the same time, of course, what I showed is how historians, of course, always tend to stitch up the breach, but transforming precisely the power of the mute letter, into the power of a kind of living word, and from that, I try to construct, a kind of, a kind of big conflict, between the mute letter, the paradigm of the mute letter, and the paradigm of the word, that has a flesh, whose flesh is embedded, in real life, etc., etc. And so I made kind of very long research, on what I call the politics of writing, about really that question of the relation between the letter and the body, and of course you still have the trace of it in the flesh of words and mute speech. And really, I think it is it was the background, of my research on literature. So my problem is was never, that literature has a power, has a political power, and I must elucidate this political power. No, there was I was trying, to think literature, as a kind of accomplishment, of this power of literarity in that sense, And the starting point of my research, I said this morning, it was this chapter, in Balzac's novel, The Country Parson, which of course is a kind of rewriting of this fable, of the children of the book, so precisely, plebeians, proletarians, discovering the book, and of course and Balzac's fable, of course, is exemplary, a fable of the danger of writing, and because it tells, how, the destiny, of a young daughter of a scrap metal dealer, is is perverted and devastated by the reading of a unique book. So it was a fable, that was really in the spirit of the time, It is a catastrophe. There is a catastrophe that happens, if those people are in a relation with books, with the written word. And of course, and in Balzac's novel, there is also the interesting fact, that there is the opposition between this devastating power, of the dead letter, and in front, the idea of a true writing, which is a writing, on the flesh of things, on the flesh of reality, because in the book, the good writing, is in fact consists, in digging up canals, So the idea of the good communication, between human beings, being canals, being railways, being real communication, writing, on the very soil. And so, of course, that was really the starting point. But at the same time, I had not really chosen it. Someday, perhaps, I don't remember if I had read that book, when I was young. I don't remember. But at the moment, I read this book, And what, so I stumbled on it, and well, I said, what, there is something here, there is something here that precisely links, well, literature, to, let us say, political context through this specific question, of the evil of the letter, And so at that moment, I tried, to construct, really literature, as this kind of accomplishment of the history of the dead letter, But at the same time, so this was a thread, but there was another thread, another thread that had happened, in the meantime, meaning my book on Mallarmé, So just before I had written on Mallarmé, but at the same time, when people say, well, he's dealing with the pantheon of writers, Mallarmé, of course, the hero of totalic writing, etc. Well, I must say two things. The first is that I wrote this book on Mallarmé. It was unfake, and it was not at all, expected. The fact is that a publisher, asked me to write a little book, in a collection about writers, And I said, okay, I will write on Flaubert. I said, oh, too bad, I've just signed a contract, with somebody else. So I said, okay, I will take Mallarmé. So it was not at all a cult of Mallarmé, It was a fact, that it was a substitution. But at the same time, at the same time, the fact is that my attention had been really drawn to some specific texts by Mallarmé, and notably the two texts, Conflict and Confrontation, that are descriptions of scenes, of the relation between the poet and the workers, And so, and what interested me, was that at the same time, they were more or less evoking, real scenes, scenes of the encounters, between the Saint-Simonian priests, and the workers in the 1830s. So there was this kind of analogy, this analogy between the ceremonies of the Saint-Simonian, with the intellectuals giving the hand to the workers, etc., and these two texts, by Mallarmé, about the mist, encounter, between the worker and the writer. But anyway, this means that from the very beginning, Mallarmé was for me a starting point, in all my reconstruction of so-called modernity and modernism, At this moment, it appeared to me that he was not at all, the hero of pure language, etc., etc., but a poet concerned with a problem which was the obsession of a whole century, meaning how to reconstruct, the social bond after the revolution, how to reconstruct the fabric of a community made not only of common laws, but of shared beliefs and shared modes of feeling. So, and in passing, because the question of the relation of literature to the political historical context, has been read, etc. Well, I think that for me the core of the problem, well, is not how a writer reacts to political events, or how his writing or her writing expresses the changes in the composition of constant and variable capital, as some people would like to me to address these kind of issues, So my really, I think the articulation of the problem is, well, how a mode of both a project of writing and a mode of writing, deal with social fictions, meaning social fiction, as I tried, to explain them yesterday, fictions that are efficient in governmental practice, social conflicts, social science, the organization of social forms, the construction of the collective imaginary, and so on. So what was important for me, was how really Mallarmé was concerned with this kind of global social fiction of of his time, you know. And, well, and what struck me, of course, it's not in the book because yeah, there are many, you know, the problem is that in the background of my books, there are many things that are not spelled out in the book themselves, you know. So perhaps people say, oh, but he says nothing about history, real history, etc. Which of course, for me, as something a bit strange, you know, because yeah, I think I'm the only person I know that has spent, for instance, 1 year just studying, you know, really the folders of the insurgents, you know, in June 1814. And people say, oh, but it doesn't deal with real history, you know, it's always abstract, etc., etc. Well, so just in passing, but but yes, I dealt with it, but it is because I dealt with it, and because I have in the background, you know, but I can, you know, really approach the text from a different perspective, you know. And regarding Mallarmé, you know, everybody knows, you know, this, everybody knows, of course, this opposition, very pure language against commercial language, etc., etc. But what is interesting, you know, what is interesting is that this Mallarméan concern was also a political concern at that moment, you know. And I wrote a lot of discussions, you know, about writing, but writing, you know, in elementary schools, you know. And the question how pupils must learn writing, you know, and what kind of writing, you know, is convenient, or not inconvenient, but is appropriate, you know. And for instance, you know, there was a question of the question of the mode of writing, but in a way was more was easier, you know, for young people, you know, of the working class, etc., etc., which was you know, which was the mode of writing, you know, of the bookkeepers and accountants, you know. But no, really the pupils of the Republic should not learn writing, you know, the kind of writing that is used, you know, but for commerce, you know, what is used by bookkeepers, etc., etc. So, of course, I don't at all mean that Mallarmé, you know, was aware of this, etc., etc. But it was really a big political and social concern, you know, writing. And it was not a pure idea. And, well, anyway, so I think I close the parenthesis, you know. So the process of research in mute speech was, in fact, at the crossroad of two problematics, you know, the problematics of literarity, you know, and also the beginning of an attempt, you know, to reframe modernity, to call into question, you know, the modernist paradigm of autonomy of art, autotelic language, etc., etc. You know, and at this crossroads also something happened, you know, that deviated my way, that made it deviate, you know, which was the discovery of the specific historicity of the notion of literature. When you see what is told at the beginning of mute letter, you know, well, it is only in France, so in France in the 19th century, you know, that literature becomes the name of the art of writing. And something must have happened, you know. But at the same time, you know, this something that has happened is, well, a silent revolution, you know. It did not happen because there were theories of literature, because there was, you know, Madame de Stael or German idealism, you know. Precisely what was significant, you know, is that at just a moment, you know, there is a shift, you know, from belles lettres to literature, you know. But at the same time, it doesn't, you know, coincide with any kind of manifesto, theoretical, you know, really elaboration. No. What seems to be is that the word, you know, really become, so is substituted for the other, but really as a consequence, as changes in the, you know, in the practices of writing, but have no concept, you know, in a way, you know. So and this is, of course, how I, of course, in a way, you know, so I try to reconstruct from this point, you know, the theoretical frame of the belles lettres, you know, in opposition to what was happening in literature, what was happening under the name of literature, But the point is that, well, the belles lettres, as the beaux-arts, the fine arts, they are the normative system, Literature has no normative system, and art now, and this is what I tried, of course, to discuss in aesthesis. Art precisely at the same time, at a certain moment, appears as something singular. It appears as something singular in the 18th century. Literature, at least in France, it appears as something new in 19th century, But precisely, this means that at the same time it is now a kind of specific sphere of experience, but it is no more the name of an art that can be defined, by a normative system, And so, my problem in a way, was not at all to develop the concept of literature, but rather to start from this silent revolution, and try to show how this silent literature, in fact, brought about a kind of necessity, to define, literature, or provoke the creation of a kind of literary ideal, And so, what's interesting for me, in the case of Flaubert or Mallarmé, or and Proust, is not to follow, to follow how the concept of literature, created, works, but it was the contrary, how practices of writing, at the same time create some kind of a literary ideal, but at the same time with the impossibility, of having the two, of having really the practices and the theory really match together, Well, this is, so in fact, all of those books are not at all a kind of, theory of literature, but kind of exploration, and it is of course specifically in the last part, So these books made in a way of two parts, or it's kind of interlacing of two problematic, the problematic of the dead letter, and it was in a way the end for me, of that story for me, and the beginning of my exploration of reconstruction of modernism, historical modernism. Also, there is this kind of mix, of two problematics, But what is important for me, what is important, notably in Proust, So in Proust, my problem it was how he formulates the problem, how he formulates the problem of this relation, between the necessity of a language, and the facticity, of the content of this language. So really, it was not, as I said, it was not my problem, but it was a problem, let us say, of one or two generations, and it resulted, of course, in Valéry's, of course, text, And in a way, it could be said that, the big books, of the time of Telquel, etc., were a kind of reenactment, but a reenactment at the same time forgetting the whole history, And what was interesting for me precisely was to retrace the real history, And it was the beginning of this kind of reconstruction of modernism, So what? I don't want to speak too much, But so, what is important for me, and also when I speak of the contradictions of literature, of the contradictions in Proust, etc., So my problem, as I often remember, for me. Contradictions, the contradictions, of a form of experience, don't mean, you know, that it is not workable. It's a contrary. It is a contrary. It is a contrary. What I try to say, and it is the same, you know, with cinema, with the problematic of the thwarted fable, you know. I try to say that, well, a form of art, a form of experience, you know, but lives, you know, out of its own contradiction, you know, because there is no reason, you know, there is absolutely no reason, you know, because all, you know, all practices of writing, you know, fall, you know, under, you know, under a same concept, you know, and can be explained as a implementation of the of one concept, you know. Okay, so. So of course, showing the contradictions of literature, and this is why also I addressed, you know, in this book, for instance, so Proust, you know, so from the point of view of this attempt, well, to create something as a specificity of literature, you know, and this is why also I emphasize, you know, this kind of play, you know, of displacements between impression and architecture, which in a way, perhaps it doesn't really account in a way for the construction of the book, you know. But, well, in a way, there is this kind of opposition between construction, because construction, in a way, you know, in a way, it is always the following of the Aristotelian idea, you know, of the work as a kind of organic body, coherent body, etc., etc. And on the other hand, of course, the idea of a specific poetic, you know, of the event, but there is an event, of the impression, etc. Well, okay, so it was. So mute speech, in a way, was a kind of functional work because, well, I insisted, in a way, on this contradiction that was, for them, a contradiction, you know, and specifically for Mallarmé and for Mallarmé and Proust, a kind of contradiction, you know, between the idea that there is a specific language, you know, and the fact that at the same time the content, you know, of literature in a way is indifferent. So this kind of opposition between form and content, you know, was at the center of the book, you know. But of course, what is interesting is that I totally changed, you know, the way of phrasing the problem, you know, in the following books, you know, because in a way, from politics of literature to the lost thread and the edge of fiction, in a way, it's a contrary. It's a contrary how a new poetic, you know, is precisely linked to a new word, to a new word. So, for instance, starting with politics of literature, you know, the beginning. It was a kind of result of a research, you know, I'm teaching that I made about what I call the poetics of the prose. So the problem was no more the opposition, you know, between poetry and prose, but the idea that there is this kind of new poetics of the prose. This is why the book is more or less, you know, organized, you know, also from a starting point, you know, which is Balzac, but no more the Balzac, you know, of the story of the book, you know, but Balzac, you know, as, you know, the poet of the prosaic world, you know. So that's what. So the book really was sought out of those specific moments in Balzac, you know, in the Magic Skin or in Lost Illusions, you know. So those moments, you know, when Balzac describes, you know, this kind of antique shops, you know, or bric-a-brac, you know, and the bric-a-brac becomes, you know, really the new world of poetry. And for instance, in Lost Illusion, you know, there is the poor Lucien, you know, he comes from his province with his Marguerite, his daisies, you know. But this is, for him, this is poetry, you know. And in a way, what Balzac, not only what Balzac says to Lucien de Rubempré, but, well, this is no more poetry now. Now the poetry is not in your book. The poetry is in this kind, you know, of those kinds of barracks, you know, where you want to sell your poetry. You know? So okay, and of course, if you think of if you think of the following books, you know, The Lost Thread, you know, well, really, you know, it's about the way in which, new poetic, you know, can coincide, you know, with, well, precisely the forms of life, these aspirations, you know, of those people, you know, from the lower class who want, you know, to live another form of life. This is what I mentioned yesterday, of course, notably about the issues of boredom and reverie, you know, and what I tried to show, you know, in The Lost Thread or in the edge of fiction, you know, is how precisely a new way of dealing with time, you know, is really strictly linked, you know, with this kind of subversion of social position, you know, which means that so kind of totally, and in a way, total reversal, you know, of the position or of the structure, you know, of mute speech, for instance, you know. And so from that moment, what was important for me really was to, of course, to reconstruct, you know, this whole history of modernity, you know, showing that precisely what can be said to be modern is the attempt to erase the separation between art of life, is the way in which the prose of the word, you know, really enters the world of art. And I've often said, you know, well, the sphere of art has existed, you know, from the moment when everything could enter into that sphere, you know. And this is what I try to develop, notably in aesthesis, you know, where most of the examples are precisely, you know, about the way in which, well, forms of practice that were despised, you know, popular performance, you know, the performance of the clowns or techniques or mere techniques, you know, become art. So, well, and also what was really at the core of my research was how, you know, the logic of the aesthetic regime undoes, you know, precisely some paradigms, like the paradigm of the work of art as a body, you know, as an organic body, you know, etc. And also and so how this kind of revolution in the paradigms of art, you know, well, at the same time, you know, well, raises issues of equality and inequality. So, in a way, the aesthetic regime, you know, well, is constructs itself by, you know, destroying some paradigms of what art is, that were paradigm of inequality. And of course, this is notably what I try to pursue, you know, as regards fiction, you know. So thinking how really let us say the plebeian experience, you know, of modern times, you know, well, provokes this kind of revolution in the literary revolution, you know, in the very way of emplotting time. So this kind of solidarity between, well, the time between the time of the plebeians trying to live another form of life, and the new time of a novel. So as a time of coexistence, you know, against a time of exclusion, you know. Well, perhaps it's a bit too much. It was just, you know, well, just to trace, you know, very quickly, you know, some threads. But of course, if you have some questions, objections, etc., can try to answer.